I'll move on now to Richie Merzian, Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute. Prior to taking up his role at the Australia Institute, Richie worked at the Department of Climate Change and the Department of Foreign Affairs for almost a decade and was involved in both domestic and international climate and energy agendas. He was Australia's lead negotiator on adaptation to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and helped coordinate the Green Climate Fund Board during Australia's tenure as chair. Richie also has degrees in law and economics from Sydney University. Today, Richie will talk about how to assess the effectiveness of climate initiatives in stimulating economic activity. Thanks, Richie. Over to you.
Thanks, David. It's a pleasure to talk to you and to everyone on this summit. I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal people here in capital Canberra, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and to come. And as David mentioned, I'm with the Australia Institute, which is a think tank based here in Canberra. That tries to be as much tank as think. So the research we do, we want to see applied into the public policy debate. And my focus is on climate and energy. We have a dedicated climate and energy program, and that has started a few years ago and is the legacy of the Climate Institute that existed before and packed up shop in 2017. So there's a long running body of work around how we can help Australia address the climate crisis. And today I'll go through some of the economic criteria that you can apply to stimulus programs in order to ensure that they not only address the immediate problem, but also the looming one in terms of climate change. The principles behind stimulus packages are relatively straightforward because they've been tried and tested. At the simplest form, it can be summed up in a nice 3-word slogan of hard, early, and households. Going hard means having a sizable stimulus package. Going early means getting it out the door quickly, and going households is putting that money, that fiscal policy stimulus in the hands of those who are most likely to spend it. Those are often those on lower to middle incomes. This is the policy that the Rudd government took in the face of the global financial crisis. Yesterday, I spoke to the UN chief economist in a webinar we did, who reiterated similar policies as well. So we know at the broad how to do this. This works at the federal level. It also works at the local level. And this is part of a design criteria that the Australian Institute put forward in April to assist the government in shaping packages, but it can be applied, as I said, at all levels of government. But when you go sort of that next level of detail, there's ways to target that further. So with any program, you want to ideally tick a number of these boxes. You want to generate domestic production, either to make the good or to service the good locally. You want to target sectors of the economy that are jobs intensive. And that graph there on the side is some work that we did about a month ago that shows which sectors of the economy are more likely to be better for the return on investment in terms of job creation. You often hear about governments talking about creating jobs. Well, these are the sectors where you get the best bang for your buck. And at the top, you have health, you have the hospitality sector, you have the services in social services and in sort of that assistance space. That's where you're more likely to generate more jobs for the $1 million that you invest. At the bottom of that graph, you have the mining sector, the extractions, oil, gas, coal. That's where you're going to get your least bang for your buck because they're so capital intensive. The stimulus that you put into those sectors will result in the least amount of jobs. So you want to prioritize over jobs intensive industries versus capital intensive. With any program, you want to target the most impacted. So the people who have really been put out by the recovery, and we know which sectors have been badly hit, like hospitality, like arts and entertainment, like retail. And you want to target the areas in particular that have been hit as well. And there's certainly pockets of most communities where it's more acutely felt. And then finally, and this is really what the Job Summit's about, you want to ensure that it addresses what we call co-benefits. So those might not necessarily be the principal purpose of the program, but are things that you want to address as well. And we'll dig into that a bit further. Next slide. So co-benefits can be anything in, assisting in sort of the economic space, in health, in environment, or in community. They can be immediate or they can be more longer term. But really what you want to avoid is addressing the immediate problem by exacerbating another problem. And so for this one, we want to make sure that any stimulus program that is shaped, be it at any level of the government, addresses the looming crisis of climate change, which we can all see just over the horizon, as well as addressing the immediate one, which is the economic recovery from the impacts of the COVID-19 restrictions. Next page. So what does that mean in terms of integrating climate into an economic recovery package? Well, it's understanding the future trends and risks that we face. So now with climate change, there are some impacts that are going to be, that are inevitable, that are already in train and to some extent locked in. There's still an opportunity to avoid dangerous climate change. And that's the whole purpose of the Paris Agreement. It's to limit global warming to under 2 degrees and ideally 1.5. But even at 1.5, you're still going to see serious impacts. And one of which is just there in the graph is a report that the Australia Institute did early this year that shows that Australian summers are now 50% larger than what they were in the 50s and 60s. So if you look at the temperatures that Australia enjoyed at the start and end of summer, mid-century, those temperatures are now kicking in much earlier and they're concluding much later, resulting in an expanded summer and a shortened winter. And we've got data that shows how that affects most local government areas using Bureau of Meteorology analysis. So what does that mean in shaping your economic recovery program, to know that your summers are going to be twice as long, to know that you're going to have maybe 5 times more extreme heat days? And how do you actually address that in the particular investments you make? The second part to factoring climate change in is to try and address not only building resilience to inevitable impacts, but also trying to reduce emissions, the actual mitigation component, because the best form of adapting and building resilience is actually avoidance. It's investing in mitigation, making sure that the investments you make don't exacerbate the problem, don't increase Australia's emissions. Australia's emissions are already in the top 20 globally. And those are Australia's domestic emissions. When you look at what Australia exports in its embedded emissions through its record high coal and record high gas exports, then it's more than twice that amount. So Australia's responsible for a lot of the carbon pollution, certainly much larger than the 1.3% of global emissions that you often hear people talk about. And I think, you know, off the back of the Fight for Planet Day, it's a good time to reflect on what that looks like and how we can factor those into our programs. So when you put all these principles together, it helps provide a relatively straightforward framework to then figure out whether your programs are able to hit most of the goals. So if you look at something like creating an arts and entertainment fund, because we know the arts sector has been particularly poorly hit, everything from live entertainment in the music space to actual like the sort of theater and television, sort of the whole shebang. So when you look at it across the spectrums, most of those targets are hit. You can go early, you can target it to those who have been most impacted. We know the arts and entertainment sector is highly jobs intensive, and you can also address some co-benefits there too. By contrast, you look at something like the big business tax cut that's currently on the table, it doesn't address any of the factors that we talked about. It's not early, it doesn't actually have the kind of impact you want. It's not targeted for those who are most likely to spend it or those who are the economic victims that have been most badly hurt. Something that is well within the realm of local governments is programs like urban beautification, so improving public spaces. And across that spectrum, you can see that it ticks most boxes. It can be quite targeted. It can support those who have ended up becoming unemployed or underemployed. It is a domestic production. It is jobs intensive, and you can roll it out quite quickly. And a good example of that is the City of Sydney's, sorry, not the City of Sydney, it's the City of Darwin's $5.8 million beautification project this financial year, as well as you know, accompanied by street upgrades, community infrastructure projects, those kind of things. Next slide. So taking this further into more detail, you look at something like a conservation program, and it again ticks off most of the boxes. You can roll it out early. You can make it sizable, but more often than not, it doesn't need to be. You can target it to those who are most likely to benefit from that employment and to spend that money down the track. It's jobs intensive, and also there's obviously co-benefits as well. And a good example is the City of Melbourne's urban forestry strategy. which I think they've gotten funding both from the city, but also from the state. And I guess part of these programs is also where you can attract the finance if that finance is not available for your particular local council. And their plan is to double canopy cover in the city over the next 20 years, but also improve vegetation health, improve soil moisture, improve biodiversity, improve the connection between community and the land. And for something like conservation as well, I know that the previous speaker from the Australian Local Government Association talked about how some local councils aren't necessarily strong on climate action. There's still some skepticism there, but with something like conservation, it can be depoliticized in a way that climate isn't. And I just think of the ACT government right now, where there's an election in the next month or so, and you have the Canberra Liberals running on a 1 million trees platform. So an actual conservation program is being one of their key political delivery key goals if they are elected and what they want to deliver. So it can be done sort of outside the political frame, but at the same time still take some of those co-benefits, especially on climate change. Now, something like solar tends to be more politicized because Australia's emissions are most heavily centered around electricity generation, which is still about 1/3 of national emissions. And Australia's energy is still mainly coming from coal and gas fired power stations. So we have 3/4 of our power that's coming from fossil fuels, and only 1/4 of our power, and this is in the national electricity market, 1/4 of our power coming from renewables. But at the same time, if we compare the two, you have renewables providing more than 3 times more jobs than all the coal and gas fired power station jobs in the country. So renewables are highly jobs intensive. You can target the employment in such a way as to generate broader benefits. You can target the areas that have been badly hit as well. And because we're seeing a natural transition anyway in our electricity sector, where a lot of our aging coal-fired power stations need to be retired, you're going to see smaller renewables step up, and there's a lot of opportunity to move those into areas that can benefit from it. Finally, I just wanted to end on something that carries on, I think, quite nicely from the previous speaker, David O'Loughlin, from the Australian Local Government Association, which is how are you going to pay for these programs, especially if we're seeing more and more of these disasters and crises happening more regularly. So I think of the Queensland floods in 2011, where the damage was so big that an ad hoc levy was brought in for all taxpayers. I'm thinking about the summer of disasters in Queensland over the 2018-19 period, where the Queensland government had to absorb $1.3 billion of damages. Most of those came from local governments, because local governments are responsible for 25% of Australia's high-value infrastructure assets, with only 4% of the share of public sector revenue. And so, like, whilst we can set up a disaster mitigation fund, and we certainly should, the question will always come down to, well, where is that money going to come from? And one idea that the Australian Institute is certainly behind is around a climate disaster levy. So putting a small levy on fossil fuel production, and then with that, and it can be as small as $1 per tonne of embedded emissions, you can generate $1.5 billion per annum. And that money can then be used to pay for the growing disaster bill, because we know that there will be an increase in the frequency and severity of some of these natural disasters due to the climate crisis, as well as other crises like the pandemic that we're facing. So I'll just end with a quote from the Belgian Mayor, Councillor Dominic King, that it's time for those profiting from the activities that are fueling climate change, particularly those in the fossil fuel industry, to start paying for the damage they are causing. So there's an opportunity to not just address the immediate, but then also figure out how you're going to sustainably fund the future economic recovery programs. Thanks.
Thanks, Richie. We've got time for a couple of questions. If you do, that'd be great. So I wanted to start with last week on Fight for Planet A, you touched on the topic of emissions from gas. And obviously this is a huge issue right now as we're trying to avert a gas-led recovery that too many politicians and fossil fuel companies seem to be intent on pushing. Do you have any thoughts on how councils can help steer the recovery in the direction towards renewables? And also, how important is it for local government leaders to have a conversation with their communities about gas?
Gas is quite a a loaded conversation to have right now. We've done a lot of work around assessing the value of the gas industry to Australia, and we've found that the Australian government doesn't make a lot of money from the gas sector. That there's very little tax paid by most gas corporations. There are very few jobs in the gas industry. Less than 0.2% of our workforce work in the gas industry. And as you saw from that chart, it's really capital intensive, but jobs poor. And then the third thing is that even though Australia's gas supply has tripled in the last decade, domestic gas prices have actually increased. Now, you don't have to be an economist to know that if you increase supply, that really the price should be dropping, but it hasn't, because a lot of that has been shipped overseas. So all the cheap gas, to some extent, is gone, and you've left with these questions around whether we should be digging up more expensive gas that could severely affect some of the valuable farmland that we have, because it's through more unconventional techniques like fracking. So gas doesn't really have any good news to lend to this particular recovery. But at the same time, you're seeing a number of companies push for public investment in this space, and they'll go to councils and basically offer a number of opportunities in order to sweeten the deal. But we haven't really seen those benefits fall down. So I think when it comes to gas, you really have to look at and test a lot of the merits purported by these gas companies. I think the opportunities really are in the renewables. I mean, there's more people working in installing solar panels on rooftops in this country than in all the gas and coal-fired power stations across the country. Like, the jobs that are not there, the income hasn't been there, and the damages done both to our climate and to the land are quite big. So really, you should test it out, because right now gas companies are trying to progress their interests, but they're not in the national interest and they're not in the local interest.
Thanks, Richie. You've provided some really useful criteria for local governments to use in assessing economic stimulus options this morning. In your opinion, what are the key things that local governments should be focusing on to drive economic recovery and deliver ongoing co-benefits, especially emissions reduction and climate adaptation? I mean, you talked about urban beautification and greening programs. Is there anything else that they should be focusing on?
Well, I think the Helen Haynes MP has some great ideas around community renewables. And that can be done both just in popping rooftop solar or on local buildings and schools, or alternatively investing in actual community solar. So where you don't have the space, you can find space in cooperation with the local government. They can make space available, and you can build 1 megawatt community solar facilities as well. I think there's great opportunity in those kind of things. The additional benefit as well is if you couple that with batteries too. And if the programs can include support for both solar panels and batteries, then you can also actually help Australia avoid having to install more coal and gas-fired power stations. Because if you have more batteries on the grid, then you can even out the energy demand better, which means that we don't need as many gas-fired power stations for those extreme peaks, which is where electricity demand is at a high, but then also electricity costs are at a high. So at the end, everyone will benefit, because we'll end up with cheaper electricity prices too, because we've got a more smoothed out cost. So there's lots of co-benefits that flow from looking at electricity with fresh eyes. And then there's also great things that you can do in the mobility sector as well, in terms of having more community transport options too. We saw, again, mentioned 5 for Planet A, the electric vehicles are coming to Australia. It's just a question of whether they come and disrupt our system, or whether we create and pave the way for it to be smoothly introduced. And part of the role for local government is to see how that will impact their community, whether there's a need for EV infrastructure, for charging stations where they could be placed, for whether there's an opportunity to actually integrate some in their own fleet.
Fantastic, thank you. And that takes us to the end of our time. So I'd like to thank you again, Richie, for participating today.